a few logistical notes to kind of get us started. So we are planning to offer this as a recording for asynchronous learners. We've got a few people who registered but weren't able to participate today. So please just know that that's the case and adjust accordingly if you need to. By way of introductions, my name is Marcos Stoltzfus, and I am the Director of Education here at Mary Lee. And we are very glad to be hosting you here today. I've got a few colleagues as well. The other presenter that's going to be working with us today is Carol. And so Carol, I'll let you unmute and introduce yourself and your role here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Carol Good-Elliott, and I'm an environmental educator here at Mary Lee Environmental Learning Center. And I am the lead teacher for our nature preschool, which is just starting its third year this year.
Yes, it's very exciting to be doing something and having a bit of some routine already established. So we're a little bit early here in the nature preschool game, but it's something that that we've been really excited about and that we're really leaning into and learning a lot about, including things like risky play, which is the purpose of our webinar today. So to get us started, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to play a little bit of a video clip. This is of just last week, some brand new nature preschool students. They're out in our outdoor classroom, and this is going to give you an idea of some of the things we think about when we use the words risky play. So to start off with, I'm just going to invite you to take a look at this video, and in particular, watch for the little girl that's in the very middle of the screen and see kind of what she's doing and how she's navigating this kind of challenge or this obstacle of these logs that are put vertically into the ground, and also take note of some of the other students and kids that are around here and kind of what they're doing as well. All right, here we go. Okay, what are folks noticing or what's standing out to you about what's going on in that video?
I noticed that it seemed like she was trying something new there on her own, and she got to choose where the limits were on that, but it seemed that there was some uncertainty as she was moving along the logs.
Sure, definitely. And that was a bit of a contrast from some of the other students that were either much higher on or who kind of jumped right in right where she left off even. This is a really great example for us to kind of start with in terms of thinking about what risky play can include. And we'll dig a little bit more into some of those kind of definitions and some of those characterizations or characteristics, I should say, of how risky play can look. But I wanted to kind of get that right off the bat to get our brains moving a bit about what risky play might include. And now to expand a little bit farther, I'm going to ask you to kind of visualize a bit of a spectrum from no way all the way on one side, and it depends in the middle, and then a you betcha on the right-hand side. And I'm going to read through some things that you might consider allowing children to do or not, and make a little bit of a mental tally about where you might put a certain activity. For example, letting a child interact with fire, perhaps cooking over a fire or warming themselves next to a fire. Where would you put your tally mark for that one? How about letting them start a fire? Letting a child use a knife or use a saw. Perhaps letting a child climb up a tree up to 5 feet high, 10 feet, or 30 feet. Does that adjust where you are on this little spectrum that we're making? Letting them go sledding, using scissors, swinging a stick, or moving logs larger than themselves, going wading into water, letting children fall, letting them go swinging, or letting them go off on their own. So any one of these would certainly be considered risky play. And I can assure you that we've had conversations in our programming about every one of these examples. Now, where they land, I think in general does kind of depend a lot in my eyes. But as you're thinking about where maybe you put your little tally mark on this spectrum, I'd encourage you to kind of think of that as some type of an indication of what are you thinking about as you consider these different activities. And my hope is that over the course of the rest of our webinar, we can kind of break down a little bit of what we're thinking about with these in terms of risk and how they might benefit children and strategies we might use as an educator as well. Our overall goals for today is to kind of build some familiarity with the terms and terminology of risky play, to highlight some examples, and then also to get into the ways in which we might facilitate that in an appropriately risky kind of a way. And our format is that we'll get into some of these definitions and terminology interspersed with some case studies that we're going to pull out from our experience. At the end, we'll kind of wrap up with a little bit of some thoughts about doing this in practice. And then to finish things up, we will definitely keep some space for your questions where we can be a little bit more interactive at that point. I will mention that for the most part, we're going to be running this as a webinar format. And so for us at Mary Lee, that means that it's a bit more lecture or information presentation. We also do virtual workshops that are much more structured around individual needs and the participants in a more interactive kind of a way. So my apologies in advance if it sounds like we're chatting a lot at you. So that's what we're planning to do. And to get us started, we have to talk about what risky play is. We're going to pull a definition from a researcher named Sandcedar. And I'm going to let you just read through this definition really quickly, and then I'm going to highlight a few elements. So go ahead and read through this sentence or two. So some things that kind of stand out for me on this is that this is a thrilling or exciting kind of an activity. So something that's got a bit of a lure to it for a child. That there is the possibility of injury, but that there's learning about boundaries, about risk that's embedded for the child. And that's really, kind of an important and central tenet for us as we're considering if we want to allow something quote unquote risky to be a possibility for a child to engage in. Now, a really important distinction for us is thinking about the difference between a risk and a hazard. So you can see we've got a nice hornet's nest here on the screen. This would undeniably be in the hazard category. And Ryan, when you were sharing earlier, this is getting into a little bit of what we think of as we're splitting the difference between a risk and a hazard. In part, it has to do with if a child is able to kind of choose how they want to participate, if they're even aware of it as a risk in the first place, and if it gives them the opportunity to learn to evaluate that risk along the way. So as another example, one of the things that we do to eliminate hazards in our outdoor classroom is to make sure to scan for dead limbs that are over top of where the children might be playing. That's generally not going to be something that they'll be thinking about, nor would they have a chance to opt out of playing there if the branch were to fall. And so we're going to eliminate some of those hazards while still preserving risks in other kinds of ways. If the limb were to fall, there's that almost certain chance that the child's going to be hurt. It's kind of an all or nothing type of a thing. And so that's an important distinction for us to think about as we're kind of considering what is a risky play kind of an option or activity. I'll also mention that there's some ongoing conversation about even the terminology of risky play. So some folks think that says a little bit more, it sends a bit more of a message that we want the children to be risky. And that's not necessarily the case. So they may use terminology like risk-taking play, or more commonly, appropriate risk. And so throughout, as we're saying risky play, we're also really talking about risk that is appropriate for the child where the child is developmentally. So you can kind of keep that in mind as we move ahead. So if there's so much risk, why are we even interested in this? What is it that we want for the students? Bottom line, it's because as they're taking these risks, they're actively playing. And we know that play is good for children. It stimulates their growth in all kinds of ways. The big buckets that we use at Mary Lee are the physical, emotional, cognitive, and social kind of realms, and that's really how they can grow and learn through these kinds of opportunities. That said, there's a lot of literature out there that talks about why it's good for students to be playing outside, including in risky ways. And so what I have to show here is a bit of an excerpt from an article on tree climbing and the risks and benefits of tree climbing. The authors of that article included a bit of a literature review to explore what the research has shown that the benefits accrue to children as they do this kind of a play. You can see that this is a pretty nice list here, and it's only one little screenshot from their article. We're talking about all kinds of things from dexterity to spatial awareness, self-confidence, and all kinds of different benefits that, ideally we want children to be able to have and to grow in. So overall, I would say some of the things that we expect by providing this opportunity for children is that they're learning how to stick with it. They're learning how to experience failure and to persist. And that really, across the board, the most important piece is that we want children to be able to learn what they're comfortable doing, to see growth in doing it, and to be able to say, am I ready for this particular activity or this particular risk? That we want them to learn how to navigate that at a way that they are ready for or not yet, I should say. So to get into the details here, that same researcher talks about 6 different types of risky play as kind of our categories. And we're going to quickly go through these, some in a little bit more depth than others. And we're going to be presenting 3 different case studies in these different categories of how we've really embraced that or explored it in any case within our programs at Mary Lee. And the first one is, well, they have great names, of course. So the first one is Great Heights. And the thing I'll, of course, mention is that height is certainly a relative term. It's subjective. And so it depends on the student themselves, kind of what they're ready for. And so for this one, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carol. And Carol, would you mind just talking us through a little bit of how has climbing and the risk of falling manifest itself? Like, what does that look like in our, especially nature preschool program, something that happens every day of the week, 4 days a week from September all the way through May? Like, what does the climbing or Great Heights actually look like for our students?
Thanks, Marcos. So our climbing happens in our outdoor classroom in a few different ways. Hang on just a second here. Am I unmuted, Marcos?
I can hear you fine, yes.
Okay, then I'm going to clear a screen that popped up in the middle of everything for me there. Sorry. That said I wasn't. So climbing is something that happens pretty much every day in our outdoor classroom. And we have a number of different places where climbing happens. So in that initial video that Marcos showed, you saw one of our climbing locations with the upright logs that are set down in the ground. So they're really stable, really sturdy, and sort of stair step up to that set of logs, tree stump that has been cut off at different heights to provide another climbing place. There's this tree that's shown in this particular photo, which is a lovely, sturdy black cherry tree. The bark is actually getting worn really smooth from all of the children who have climbed on it. I was noticing that today when I was helping a child for the first time climb this tree. So we have everything from those kinds of stumps to stand on, to logs that are laying on the ground, to a ramp type log, a much longer log that we'll see in just a little bit as well. How do we facilitate it? We have made a choice that anytime children are going to be climbing on something taller than a log laying flat on the ground, that we want to make sure there is an adult who is paying attention to that, especially early in the year as the children are just getting to know the space and getting familiar with how to climb in that space and getting comfortable in their bodies with the climbing that they're doing. So, for example, in this case, with the photo that's here, for example, this child This was early in the year also, the year that that child was a student, and he was just figuring out how to get up on the tree. He wanted help getting up. He actually was asking for me to put him in the tree, and I said, no, that's not what I'm going to do, but I can help you figure out how to get there. And these other children who were around also were helping him figure out how to do it. They suggested bringing these log stumps, the log cakes, we call them, the sections of log over, and use those as steps to help get a little higher. Meanwhile, I was there watching, monitoring, making sure that he was the only one on the tree. There wasn't anyone else getting too close that was also trying to climb or push or anything like that, or accidentally getting kicked by this child's feet moving around, that kind of thing. So that's one example of how we've facilitated it. Let's see, Marcos, could you go ahead and go to our next photo? I think.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go. So there's another example from a little later in the year, getting a sense of, this is the same tree. So you can see there's a child much higher up in the tree now. That's a child who was very comfortable in his body with climbing. He's a child who climbed a lot at home before he ever came out to us. We figured out pretty quickly that he was comfortable with climbing, and sometimes more comfortable getting into spaces than we necessarily were ready for him to be at. So that his height right there was getting to the limits of how high we have chosen to allow children to go. One of the things that we teach the children is that in our outdoor classroom space, they may climb as high as the adult with them can reach. In case the child got stuck somehow in that space, got hurt there and needed help getting down or something like that, we want an adult to be able to reach the child. And so that child had hit his limit with the teacher who was standing there monitoring that day, or at that particular time in that day. And there you can see other children who also were ready and wanting a turn getting up in the tree too. The teacher was keeping an eye on that and was making sure that there weren't more than, one other child on the trunk down lower, for example, as this child was there and was ready to help facilitate if he started backing down the tree and there was another child in the way.
Carol, one of the things I love about this photo is that
Mhm.
that little tree climber is almost camouflaged way up there. Like it's kind of hard to
Yes.
see him, but
Yes.
he actually fits in quite nicely. And as you said, he was really comfortable.
Mhm.
Just to highlight a few things that I'm hearing you say, you described having one teacher kind of assigned to climbing.
Yeah.
And something that we've often talked about as a team is that that's the one teacher, one risk strategy. So if there were also going to be some other kind of risky play going on a day that there's climbing going on, we would only introduce that if we had another teacher kind of assigned to that other risk, and that we wouldn't ever combine those. And that's
Yeah.
an important facilitation strategy. The other rule that we have in our classroom that I'll highlight is kind of the over under rule. So Carol was describing, making sure that a kid wasn't getting kicked by swinging legs. And so we talk about making sure that you're checking under you if you're the climber and checking above you if you're not, to make sure that you're not playing underneath where someone might be climbing as well. So just another few kind of quick examples. And unfortunately, we're going to be kind of buzzing quite quickly through all of these. We could talk a lot more about many of them. But Carol, would you like to move to the next two videos that we have that kind of show some progression?
Yes, let's do that. And these two videos that Marcos is pulling up right now for us are actually from this past week, again, with students who were just starting up with school for the year. The first video is two students who are brand new to our classroom.
All right, let's see how it looks.
This looks like it's easy. Yeah. That looks like it's easy. Looks like it's easy. It's easy. Climb up this tree. This is how far I can make it up. Then I go around and jump.
Okay, so you can kind of see that this student is getting more comfortable using hands and feet on it. And there's another child kind of towards the bottom who elected maybe not to climb all the way up the tree in this particular moment. And then, Carol, what do we have going on in the second video?
Yeah, and just to say, this is the tree, the log that I mentioned that we call our ramp log. It's a large ash trunk that had come down in a storm and is hung up at a real low angle um, off the ground for a chunk of the way. So it makes a nice ramp, and it's a really long straightaway for the kids to climb on. In the second video, this was taken maybe about 10 minutes after the first one. So it's the same student in the front climbing on the log at this point, followed by another child who was in our nature preschool all of last year as well and is back again this year.
Okay, let's see what goes on in this video.
I can do it too.
All right, well, I apologize a little bit for the choppiness there. Hopefully you can see that that first student, I mean, Carol, he's getting pretty comfortable. He's now walking without his hands
Mhm.
and at a little bit of a faster clip.
Yep. Yes, he definitely was. Meanwhile, the other child behind him was running up and down the log. And yeah.
And we kind of think that that shows that he's become much more comfortable and familiar with not only kind of the physical demands of that kind of an activity, but also mentally that he's feeling comfortable enough to be able to do that. So,
Yeah.
so this is a good example of kind of what it is that we're looking at when we're trying to do risky play, so to speak, for children to grow and develop. We're going to move on to our next type of risky play, which is high speeds. And I would say that this is one that we're actually pretty familiar with as a culture or as a society. This is, kind of that funny feeling in your stomach when you're going really fast and maybe even like borderline out of control. So things like when you're swinging or biking, and this is something that we're a little bit more familiar with because of those kind of typical maybe playground equipment or biking. Like I said, slides are a great example of high speed risky play as well. In our programs, this is mostly showing up in times of winter when we're sledding, or just the joy and the thrill of running pell-mell down a hill, sometimes careening into others, perhaps sometimes even on purpose as well. But that kind of idea that you might crash is the risk that we're talking about here. And so the students are kind of figuring out what is uncontrolled versus controlled. How do I, kind of direct my movement and my body and some of those kinds of things. The next type of risky play we're going to talk about is in the category of dangerous tools. And you can see that we here have a student who is working with a pruning shears to cut a twig to a length kind of his desiring. And this is going to be our second case study. So I'm going to move it to our next slide showing a student sawing. And Carol, can you talk to us a little bit about what's going on here?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So we do have a variety of different tools that we introduce to the children over the course of the school year. The pruning shears are one example. The saw that you see here in this photo is another example. Hammers and nails, things like files, wood files that can be used to carve things. Let's see, scissors are another example. In all of these cases, we introduce the tool to the children during our community circle time. We bring out the tool, show what it is, ask how many have seen this kind of tool before and can name it. If any of them have used that kind of tool before. And that the answer is very dramatically depending on the tools, of course. And then I model, or whichever teacher is leading on this one, models how to use the tool. We talk about with the children, we ask the children, like, what do they see that they would consider something to pay attention to as they're using the tool. How might someone get hurt with this tool? How can we use it safely? That kind of thing. And then we also provide safety equipment for them that is appropriate to whatever the tool is. So typically when the children are hammering and nailing or using a saw, they would have safety glasses on that can keep sawdust from getting their eyes or keep a nail from like flicking back and hitting their face. Um, we have leather gloves that are child-sized leather gloves that they can use in situations when it's warm enough that they wouldn't already have other gloves on to help protect their hands some as well. So those are some examples. In our first year of preschool, the children actually did a tremendous amount of sawing and hammering and actually put together a little shelter for themselves, built it all themselves, with adults helping kind of hold it up as they were hammering it together and things like that. So it's something that that we find is really important and valuable for the children.
Great, thank you very much.
Sure.
And one of the reasons, of course, that we even think about the value of using tools is because, of course, this is something that we're going to encounter later in life, either as older children or when we become adults. And I think in general, we're kind of used to that when it comes to things like scissors. And you know, we know that there's child scissors and you have to practice that. But it's certainly true across the board in many different ways. There are some programs nationally or internationally that really take this far, and they might even use power tools with children. And they've got, you know, guidelines of what age they use it and maybe some kind of an orientation or directions of like what they have to do to use it. But, you know, the ability to know how to use a tool and use it carefully is certainly a critical skill to be able to have. Moving on to our next type of risky play, we have dangerous elements. And so this is basically the risk of children falling into something or off of something a little different than climbing, or hurting themselves through some other kind of a way. And so the examples we have here are these big old branches or logs that might wallop somebody in the head, the use of fire in programming, or wading, sometimes going out on ice and kind of the prospect of falling you know, on the ice and hurting yourself or banging your head or that kind of a thing. And this is a whole other category of risky play. We have embraced most of those in our programming. The picture of fire here is from a forest kindergarten in a school district that we've collaborated with. We have not chosen to use fire in our programming, mostly from a logistical and scheduling standpoint. The place where we have our outdoor classroom is a bit of a walk, and so being able to kind of start that fire and leave it unattended while we get back there with the children is kind of a non-starter for us. But I would say philosophically, you know, with the right arrangement, we would certainly bring that in as an element, and we would again take it very carefully and talk to the children about how to do that in a careful and appropriate way. So again, it's learning how to navigate these things that they might encounter later in life, and they can build their skills of knowing how to navigate that. The second to last type is rough and tumble play. So we're thinking about things like wrestling or roughhousing or play fighting. And in these pictures, you can see some various iterations of, I don't know, I think maybe being imagined to play bears and wrestling each other to the ground and falling down a hill again and again in a repeated kind of a way. I will say that this is one of the types of risky play that as a staff, we were initially less comfortable with. I think in a lot of educational programs, we're pretty used to saying no fighting, no wrestling. And through some of our conversations, not only within our team, but with our partners, the YMCA out of Kendallville, where they're the co-teachers with us in our program, we had some good conversations that said, well, this is a type of risky play. How might we enable it and facilitate it so that it can be supported in helping the students especially learn about consent as it comes to physicality? And so whereas before maybe we were more willing to say like, no, we're not going to be doing that. I'd say in the past year especially, we started to figure out what can this look like, and paid more attention to helping a student say, oh, I hear you saying the word no. Are you saying that in play, or do you actually want them to stop? And how do you communicate the difference between those two? And to another student, I hear this person saying no. How can you be sure that they're actually saying that or playing saying it? And what are the signs, or how can we communicate with each other? And so this type of risky play is all about navigating those kinds of interactions where they might harm each other. And so this is a very pro-social kind of a thing to be able to learn, so that we can understand how to interact with one another in safe ways. Our last one that we're going to talk about is the risk of disappearing or getting lost. The risk here is kind of the idea of an adult not knowing where you are, or a child learning their independence and getting further away from maybe supervision than they typically have the opportunity to, or that they're typically used to. This is one of my favorite stories from our preschool in the past few years. And so, Carol, I'm going to turn it back over to you and ask you to kind of introduce what we're seeing here in this photo. And then we've got a really nice video to get to here in just a second.
Yeah, so this is a photo that is taken right next to the outdoor classroom space that we're in most days. It is a tall grass prairie plot, fairly large tall grass prairie plot. And the mowed area that you see there on the right-hand side of the screen is a trail, one of our regular walking trails here at Mary Lee, that goes between the outdoor classroom and this prairie. So just outside the entrance to our outdoor classroom, we have this beautiful tall grass prairie, and we decided last year, I guess it was, that we were going to make a path through the prairie that the children could go and spend time on by themselves without an adult standing there right with them monitoring, to give them this chance for feeling like they were disappearing away from us. So we trampled a path that was basically just wide enough for a person, people single file to move through. Trampled a path that wound its way around through through the prairie. Now, as you're looking at the prairie, I think probably in this photo, you can see that off on the left-hand side of the picture, there are a couple small bodies, and on the mowed path, there is another small body. So you can see that the prairie plants are tall enough that they're taller than the children are, but not so tall that an adult standing on the path can't see where the children are. So the children could go through there and feel like, I'm hiding, they can't see me, not realizing that we could actually basically see where they were, especially when they had on their orange raincoats, which really helped them stand out. We structured this so that the children could take turns going up to 3 at a time, moving through this path. And they spent a lot of time, many of the children spent a lot of time running through there, or going with 2 other children, and they would pretend to be different creatures or things and moving through through our what we called our prairie path.
Cool, thanks for that background. And what we're going to do now is take a look at what that was actually like from the point of view of one of the children. So here we go. We'll see kind of how this looks from the child's eyes. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what that was like for the students as they were doing it. And we certainly found that they enjoyed going through there, and we think that in part that has to do with this type of risky play. That this was one of the places in our outdoor space where the students were able to get farther away from an adult or each other than they typically would be able to. And in fact, as we kind of watched the winter batter down some of these grasses, we found that they were more than willing to even go further afield. And so, as with any of these categories, we saw them building comfortability and kind of getting further along with it. So just to kind of do a quick recap, the researcher that we've referenced categorizes these 6 types that we've kind of had a chance to just give you a little bit of a sense of. One of the things that I'll just highlight again is that some of these we're a little bit more maybe comfortable with than others, but that it depends a lot on the context. And so what we want to do next is move into thinking about, like, if we wanted to incorporate risky play into our programs, what would that actually look like in practice? And so there's a few things that I would kind of highlight as a practitioner approaching this to think about. And the first one is, what is one's mental approach? How do you think about the idea of risky play in the first place? And part of that is making the case either for yourself or to an administrator, a board, or someone who is kind of not too sure or not too skeptical or is skeptical about it. And one of the first things that I would mention is that there's certainly a tendency of assigning something that is unfamiliar with a high level of risk. And I would caution us to be careful about that. And the reason that I say that is, I think, best illustrated with an example. So we're very used to riding in vehicles, and driving cars is actually quite a risky thing to do. If you look at the statistics for injury, that's far and away, well, it's more than what we're used to, but we're familiar with the activity overall. And so for a property or a program who might be thinking about tree climbing as an example, they might immediately go to, well, this is risky, people are going to get injured, or they have a chance of getting injured. And I would encourage someone in that situation to really do a little bit of research and find out, is the likelihood of getting injured actually that much higher? Or is it in fact more that we're unfamiliar with it, and so it feels intuitively like it is more risky than we might otherwise think? The second kind of thing to pay attention to is there is a paper that talks about the surplus safety factor, and that there's irony in this, that oftentimes the decisions that we make about what children are allowed to do are in fact based off of the fact that our society is fearful of lawsuits. And so we might make decisions about what children can do based off of that rather than what is actually risky or problematic for the children. And so we have the surplus of safety, and at times this can actually go so far as to being, it can have a bad effect on the children's development because we're withholding opportunities from them. But because of those fears of lawsuits or something. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and so I'm not saying that I have a legal case for you to fall back on, but I would say that we need to be thinking carefully about why we're making the decisions that we are. The way to flip that whole question on its head is, what are we not allowing the children to learn by withholding some of these opportunities or activities? Another way to think of it is, what is the risk, or is it actually truly a hazard? So some tools that kind of help us to feel better about doing this, this quote unquote risky stuff with children. First of all, hopefully you've heard a fair amount from what Carol has shared or what I've mentioned, that there are plenty of protocols and strategies that are available for us to use to mitigate the riskiness of any given activity. So sure, it'd be pretty risky for us to hand a whole bunch of 4-year-olds a whole bunch of pruning shears and not give them any kind of direction nor supervision about that. I can see where that would go bad places. And the way in which we introduce pruning shears is very different than that. And so we're structuring it, and we have strategies. The one teacher, one risk strategy is, of course, one of them that I've mentioned. And there are others that think that both physically or behaviorally about how we might facilitate that in such a way to make it a little bit less injury prone for the child. The one that I'm going to spend a little bit more time on here in just a moment is risk-benefit analysis. And ultimately, though, the thing that we're going to need to think about is you will have to choose what's right for your context. And my example here is that a school that's in the deep north of Minnesota is going to have different kinds of risk that they're willing to take about cold weather than someplace in Indiana or Tennessee or Alabama. And those are all going to be very different depending if you have 5 children you're supervising or 12 children that you're supervising, and a whole host of other factors. And so those are things that are real that we want to pay attention to and think about. To help with that, I would like to highlight this tool called a risk-benefit analysis. And one of the better ones that I have found comes to us from the government of South Australia. And so this is just a very basic tool. It's got kind of some example answers filled in here. And one of the things that they start off with, which I think is notable, is that they're identifying the benefits of the activity that they're talking about. So in this case, they're talking about tree climbing. And right off the bat, they're starting by saying, what is the opportunity for the child to learn? And they're identifying confidence, coordination, problem solving, and a host of others. They circle back to this non-negotiable element after they've done the full risk assessment. This is basically their way of saying, what do we have to do to be able to do this activity in the first place? On the second page here, I really like how they've got this set up. So basically the first column is the hazard, and notice the wording there. Basically like what can happen, that is the riskiness that we're worried about. For example, falling from a tree, getting stuck, or a tree branch breaking. They put in a preliminary risk in place, and then they identify what the reduction or control measures are. This is things like the strategies that we're talking about, or in this case, removing some of the limbs that need to be removed to keep children from climbing an unsafe tree, or whatever the case may be. They identify how that's going to be implemented, and then they give a final level of risk after those mitigation tactics have been put in place. Now, for their purposes, ultimately, they want to circle either on the benefits outweigh the risk or the risk outweighs the benefits. And they kind of have some documentation about who's preparing this. The thing I really, really like is this part down here, the risk matrix. And this is their way of trying to identify, I guess, frankly, how are we going to talk about these different consequences, severity, and how likely they actually are. And I like it because it provides two kind of axes to think about. So it's putting more nuance to the idea rather than just saying climbing trees is risky. And instead it's saying, well, let's talk about why we think so. And so the way that they've broken it down is across the top, they have their likelihood. Is something likely or unlikely to happen? And that moderates how we might think of allowing the students to do it or not. On the other axis, we've basically got the consequence. If something did go wrong, how bad is it going to be? And some of those, they'd be really critical, and we want to pay really close attention to that. And maybe that's not one that we're gonna start off with. But there's certainly some where it's a minor abrasion or a bump. And those are things that happen with children like on a sidewalk, frankly, also. And so it helps us to kind of do a little bit of some comparing and build some common language so that ultimately we can say, okay, based off of the likelihood and the consequence, we're assigning this risk at a low, moderate, high, or extreme level. And that helps to give us some examples of how we might want to think about certain risks, both before and after the strategies that we put in place. So I think that's just kind of a nice way to approach it, and it's a very kind of concrete and simple way to think about it so that we don't have to get bogged down into details or kind of non-specifics. I'm going to just pull up one more example that I think does a really nice job of describing how a different program can approach this in different ways based off of their context and their needs. Second while I find myself again. All right, as I'm pulling this up, I'll just mention we're quickly approaching the question and answer part of the webinar. And so if there's things that you're wondering about, you can either start to put those into chat or start formulating those, because we'd be glad to have a little bit of a chance to talk with you. Okay, so here we've got an elementary school. So not a place that you typically think of as embracing risky play, but the way that they've chosen to do it is by taking advantage of this kind of rip-rap flood control structure that they have built into their landscaping. And so this is just a whole bunch of rocks. If it were to flood, this is going to fill with water. That's the function of it. But during COVID, when the teachers were having to space out their classrooms, they kind of branched out away from the playground structure and the grass into this area. And they started to think, oh, well, maybe we could actually go out there and use it as a play area. And I think at first they were having to figure out, like, well, what if a rock were to roll, or what if the student were to fall? But they either formally or informally went through this process of trying to determine if it's something that they would be willing to do. And ultimately, they found that the students loved playing in this area. You can see that they kind of have this low spot, and there was a lot of rock moving going on. They had made little imaginative houses or dens, and this was a great spot for their students to be able to practice their balance and their agility and to navigate, is this rock a stable rock or is it a wobbly rock? And so I really love this example because it just shows that it doesn't have to be a crazy thing that we're doing, that it might be a one step at a time kind of an example. And that if this school never got to tree climbing, like, that's okay. We don't need everyone to get there, but it's great for us as educators and as practitioners to be thinking about how we can kind of deepen the experiences that we're giving to students in the areas that we are interacting with them. So risky play can look a lot of different ways, and still have those really good benefits for children. Okay, we are just about perfectly on time, if not a little long-winded, but we do want to keep some time for questions. And so for the last little bit here before the 5 o'clock hour, we'd be glad to field those. And if anyone has one, you can either unmute and just ask that outright, or you can drop them into chat. As folks are doing that, Carol, I'm curious, is there anything in the risky play category that you found yourself pushed on, or that you're surprised that maybe you wouldn't have embraced it on, at some point earlier, but that you've had to kind of grow your thinking in?
Yes. I would say particularly the rough and tumble play is one that I continue to really think about how to support, how to support the children in that kind of play. I certainly intellectually understand the benefits of it, and having grown up in a family where that wasn't a thing that was encouraged, like I'm recognizing I need to kind of get myself out past that. So I would say that's the one that's been the most challenging for me. Yeah. And all of it has been a growing experience for me.
Sure,
great.
sure.
It's been great.
Wonderful. Well, it doesn't look like we have any folks with questions at this point, and so I think we're going to wrap things up. As always, feel free to reach out to us afterwards, and we'd be glad to chat further and talk a bit about kind of what we've experienced in our work, not only with forest kindergartens and nature preschool, but also in things like after-school programs or spring break day camps and other kinds of ways that we've encouraged students to take a few risks and to grow from it along the way. The last thing that I'll mention, just so that folks are aware, is that we do have a few resources that are available to folks. One of which is a PDF that I'm going to be sending through chat here in just a moment. And that is a chance to see some of what we've included here today, summarized, as well as a link to a few different resources that we want to highlight. One of which is, well, I guess I'll do my slide first, then I'll show the book that I have in front of me, so don't let me forget. But what you have on the screen here is a few different things that Mary Lee specifically offers to area educators to think about outdoor play, risky play, and that kind of a thing. One is a monthly virtual meeting called the ECHO Network. This is just about a year old, so it's still a little bit new. That stands for Early Childhood Hoosiers Outdoors. And this is a practitioners meeting where we get together and we share what we're up to, the things that we're working on or challenges, and kind of trade insights, resources, and in some cases commiserations, I suppose, as well. So it's a nice chance to connect with other practitioners, and that happens, I believe it's the third Monday of the month at 4 o'clock. So the Echo Network is listed in the PDF that I just put through the link, and you're welcome to access that on our website. We also offer in-person and virtual PD. We've got one coming up about connecting with academic standards from outdoor programs. And we also have observation opportunities where folks can come out and see these little tykes running up and down the log in person, not choppy nor through your computer screen. And we find that that far and away is the most valuable chance to really understand kind of what's going on and how that magic happens, and to brainstorm what that might look like in a drastically different context as well. I'll also point out that we have online resources in the form of PDFs that are prepared and on our website. That's on things like creating lesson plans for outdoor spaces, kind of an overview of the research and resources available, and a variety of others as well. The last thing that I want to add is that one of the books that we've drawn on pretty heavily is this one. It's called Adventures in Risky Play. The author's name is Rusty Keeler, and I love the subtitle of this one, What is Your Yes? And the way that Rusty kind of puts it is, it's really up to us to provide students with these opportunities. And so how can we get to a yes when maybe your gut reaction is, no, we can't do that, like you'll get hurt. And so it's a really nice overview of this topic. It gets into a lot of real great depth, concrete examples, and it's just a great resource to explore for anyone who's wanting to dig in a little bit further. I think with that, we are going to wrap it up. Carol, any other notes that you want to add?
I would love to have folks come out and visit our classroom and watch the children in action, and yeah, and have a chance to find out what kinds of risky play strategies and ideas other folks have used as well. There's always so much more to learn from each other.
It's fun to compare notes and to push each other to try new things. Okay, well, with that, thanks everybody for joining. We wish you the best in your journey of working with students and growing and learning as educators as well. Hope you have a great evening, and thanks for tuning in for our webinar today. Bye, everybody.